Hey everybody, David Pingree here with RacerX Online, bringing you a dialed-in video today for the 2020 Honda CRF450. Put a long day in on this thing here at Glen Helen, and we've come up with some really good settings. As we mentioned in our introduction video, not a lot of changes on this bike, but the changes they made were significant. Just that battery box dropping down changed the characteristic of the power in here, and they did some different mapping things and added the traction control and some stuff, but just a really monster of a motor, which is exciting. But that means there's a lot of options to set this thing up, so let's jump into it. We'll start with this suspension. We started at 105 sag. That's what Honda and Showa recommended. They were out here today. Thank you to the folks at Showa for helping us. 105 millimeters of sag. And then for me, when I initially went out in stock settings, it felt a little bit low in the front to me. So we did a couple things. We started by opening up the high-speed compression in the rear. That didn't quite get me there. We farted around with some other things that didn't work. And what we ended up coming back to was dropping the forks down in the triple clamps a little bit. Because again, I talk a lot about finding a balance, and that's important on any motorcycle. And my settings don't mean they're exactly going to work for you, but it's a good baseline if you're having the same feelings I was. If it feels stink bug to you, the fix that Honda recommended, that Showa suggested, was dropping the forks down. Now they come 5 millimeters from the top is standard. So we went down 3 millimeters to a 2 millimeter setting. So that gave me my front end ride height where I wanted. Okay, and we had initially done some other things with clickers that were wrong, so we backed those back out. And that's just trial and error. That's going to happen. You know, you have a feeling and you're like, oh, it feels too stiff. I want to soften it. We were actually too deep into the stroke, and I was down into the stiff valving. So you learn right away, okay, that didn't work, so that must be the case. We're down into the stiffer part of the valving. Let's correct that. So that's why we dropped the forks down. We ended up speeding the rebound up. So I'll kind of give you the settings we ended up with here. One stiffer on compression up top. And standard is 8, by the way, rebound is 7, and then one open on rebound. So one stiffer, one in on compression, and one out on rebound. So it gave me a little bit firmer feel, which kind of held me up. And then we opened the rebound up so that it moved a little quicker and would hold me up taller as well there. And the importance of being kind of up in that initial part of the stroke, if your fork is sitting too far down in, you know, there's the initial part, maybe the first third of the travel, is where that soft, supple feeling comes from. So little chatter around sweepers, out of turns. If you're getting just a ton of feedback and it's, you know, hurting your hands, that's a problem. And it's one of two things. Either you're just way too stiff on your compression clicker, which is not usually the case. More often than not, you're down past that initial third of the valving stack and down into where it starts getting firmer to hold you up on big landings and things, but you're in that part of the stroke for little chop and bumps, and it's just reacting too much. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you want to get back up into that top part of the stroke so you've got some nice supple suspension valving right there. So that's what we ended up doing. And the fork felt awesome to me. Really, really good. Sometimes you think, if you bring it up too high, it won't turn as well. I didn't have any of those issues. It was really good. On the shock, let's go back. 105 sag. Standard is 7 on the rebound, 9 on low speed, and 3 out on high speed. That's your standard setting. Okay, and it wasn't too far out for me. The shock is pretty close, to be really honest with you. I went a quarter turn out on the high speed, so a little bit softer. It's going to squat me down just a touch. And I was looking for a little bit more softer feel on the little chatter, exiting turns and stuff like that, high speed stuff. So I went 2 out on the low speed. So 2 clicks out on the low speed compression and a quarter turn out on the high speed. Just softened it up a touch for me. And that was my balance point. I felt like it was riding totally neutral, absorbing bumps well. I wasn't blowing through on big jumps. So at 170 pounds, that's a pretty good baseline for you. Again, if you're a little bit more, I'm saying their range on this is probably 170 to 200, the spring rate. That's my guess. So you'll be pretty close with that. Give it a try if you're struggling to get a good setting. I want to jump over to, you got to be like a NASA engineer almost to figure some of these things out. It's going to take some time. Don't be intimidated by all these buttons. You've got 3 ignition mappings, okay, in this far button over here. Hold it down for 3 seconds. It'll blink once, twice, or 3 times. That'll tell you what map you're in. It's standard, traction, and aggressive. Okay, so the standard map obviously is standard. The traction map is for when it's very hard and slick. It's basically just going to be a little bit smoother delivery of power, build a little bit slower. So if you're on very slick surfaces, it's not going to break loose as quickly. And then the last one is just aggressive, just exactly as it sounds. Maybe for high elevation tracks, deep sand tracks, maybe thick mud, I don't know, wherever you think that might work for you. Or if you just like a very explosive bike. But play with those and get to know what each one of them does. Then the next button over, this is your traction control button. Same theory here. You've got 3 different traction control settings, 1, 2, and 3, and they go up incrementally in terms of how much intervention the electronics provide. So the first map, very little. You don't really, it's very subtle. The second map a little bit more, and the third a little more. And the way this is ratioed is in RPM spikes. So it's not a real wheel position sensor. It's if your RPMs are here, and they go whoop, and they jump up really quickly, it'll cut the RPM, the ignition down, and keep that rear wheel from breaking loose. So it really gives your back wheel like a more planted feel as you're exiting a turn or accelerating. So play with those, you will feel them. That third one, it's a lot of intervention. Again, that's going to be for just slick, muddy situations, hard slick, dry slick, guys that are doing maybe off-road events where it's just, dry and slick. That's a really good option. And you may want to run this off. If it's super tacky, maybe there's no need for it. So, but play with it and understand what it does. There's also a launch control. You hold that thing down, and it's the start button. Once you've got the bike going, hold it down for 3 seconds. You're gonna have a purple light blinking over here that tells you that the launch control is on. Once you hit a certain RPM, it'll drop off. Play with that as well, because that's great for concrete starts or starting pads that are slippery, less traction, right? So I know it's intimidating, especially for old farts like me who aren't super tech savvy, but just play with it, get comfortable with it, because it is a good feature and it will help. It's a nice thing to have. And just so you know, I liked map 1, the standard map, and this is pretty common on these 450s. Unless you're a big boy or you're a very high level pro, the standard map is so good. The delivery of power is great. It pulls really strong through the middle and way up into the top on this year's model. But it does it in a manner that's very controllable. Once you go to 2, I didn't love it. Again, maybe if it was really slippery, I would. And 3, it was just too much. It's just I'm making more mistakes. The bike's kind of stepping out on me even when I would put the traction controls on. I like the standard map. Pretty straightforward for me. And then traction control 2 was kind of my sweet spot. At Glen Helen here, you always have like this nice fluffy top with a hard base. So occasionally you'll come out of a turn and hit that base and it wants to snap out on you. And I was just helping kind of minimize some of those mistakes. So I like that. Okay, a couple of other things I just want to throw at you. One, get rid of these grips, stock Honda grips. I don't know why they're still using these things. It's the one thing about these bikes I hate. They're bulky, they're hard as a rock, they will destroy your hands. I get rid of those. The bars, I like the 7/8 bar better. It gives you a little bit more flex, kind of a more supple feel. These don't bend as easily though, so if you crash a lot, you're gonna definitely like these more. Pay attention to the markings on the center of this bar. Just eyeballing it with the 7/8 bar that has a crossbar or a twin wall, you can really get an idea of how far back the bar is rolled just by looking at that. But it's tough with this. It is nice that they've got hash marks on there and numbers so you can be specific with where you're at. But always take a look. I noticed, I looked at them and went, oh, they're good, and then I went out and they were way too far forward. So it's kind of hard to tell by just glancing at it. So just throwing that out to you. One thing that some people did try, this was a Honda recommendation, if you are having stability issues, you feel like maybe the tracks you ride are really high speed or you do off-road, some people were adding a longer chain and leaving the stock gearing, but adding like a half an inch to half an inch further back on where the wheel sits, and that was helping with some stability issues, if you have any. I didn't have any here at Glen Helen today, but again, that's going to vary rider to rider and track to track. And then lastly, one thing that they did on the 250 is they added a filter that has more volume. So cage and everything is the same, but the filter has sort of a bigger pocket up top. And it was a noticeable horsepower improvement on the dyno. It didn't get put on the 450 for some reason, but they said that you can take it off the 250 or put that 250 filter in here, and it does increase horsepower numbers. So that's something you want to try. Go ahead and do that. Those were our settings. That's what I found on this bike that worked great for me, and I loved it. I really enjoyed riding this motorcycle. It's very comfortable, intuitive. It's you can ride it. It kind of wants you to push it hard. which made it a lot of fun for me. So awesome motorcycle, Honda. You guys crushed it. You guys are going to enjoy it if you have one of these. Try some of those settings. I hope they help you. Enjoy your 2020 Honda CRF450. We'll see you on the next Dialed In.